Today we're getting into the partner model reviews for the RTX 3080 video cards. Obviously there's an availability issue right now, but once the cards become available, all this testing will remain just as useful when you're actually buying the devices, because most of the stuff we're looking at is thermals, it's quality of life features like acoustics over time, the VBIOS fan profile. We're looking at frequency, which is a potential lead into issues, as we'll discuss in other pieces, being too high mostly on some partner models. And then we're looking at pressure, mapping the Coldplate flatness, and of course a little bit of gaming performance too. So we're starting with the Gigabyte RTX 3080 Eagle, which has some downsides for sure, but is an MSRP priced card. Before that, this video is brought to you by the EVGA XR1 capture device. The new EVGA XR1 capture device is OBS certified and doesn't require any drivers. So it's a plug-and-play solution supporting 1080p 60 capture, and importantly for us or overclockers, it can stream BIOS capture without issue and is more reliable when used with an unstable overclock. The capture card has a built-in audio mixer, it can pass through 4K, and includes HDMI in, out, USB Type-C, console party links, and microphone in and out options. Learn more at the link in the description below. So for the Eagle, it's supposed to be a $700 video card. This is technically part of the Gigabyte brand, not the Aorus brand, which is, they're owned by the same parent company, but they're built a little bit differently. So again, lots of focus here on thermals, acoustics, noise normalized thermals, things like memory temperature and VRM MOSFET temperature. But to start with some of the build quality stuff, it's a triaxial design, it's fairly standard. They're going with a smaller fan towards the outer edge. You have this bump down towards the PCIe slot, but it is not a standard height cooler, meaning it's not limited to the size of the PCIe slot. It does get taller towards the outer edge. So that's still going to cause issues in some cases, mostly the really small cases. Immediate downsides with this card, only one VBIOS. There's no VBIOS switch on it, and that VBIOS is pretty limited. So frequency does boost higher than the Founders Edition card. We'll get plots for that in a moment. But there's no ability really to overclock whatsoever. It's very limited. We showed it in an overclocking live stream with 3 of the partner model cards, and this was the worst performing out of all of them once you get into overclocking. Out of box, it's okay, we'll look at that. This is more of like a stock user card. If you want overclocking, even just as a beginner, just to play around with it, maybe learn something or have some fun, not necessarily for performance, you should still buy something else, because this is limited to a 100% power target. It will not go higher unless some kind of special VBIOS leaks, and we don't have one right now. So that's the biggest limitation of this, aside from only one VBIOS, which isn't a big deal to probably most people, but it'd be nice to at least have a higher power target on it. That said, the VRM might not be particularly capable. We'll have to look at that or talk about that more in a separate piece. Let's get into the thermal and acoustic testing though, and then we'll do a short teardown of the card in this review as well. We're working toward testing as many partner models as we can at 40 dBA noise normalized levels, which allows us to test the cooler efficacy rather than just auto cooler performance. We do test auto numbers as well, and those are coming up, but the reason for normalizing noise levels is because otherwise you're just testing the VBIOS temperature target. Further, a less efficient cooler can blast the fan speeds to overcome other inadequacies, and so those won't show up in thermals, but they might show up in noise. Here's the first chart. Once we get to testing multiple coolers with this approach, we'll change to bar graphs with averaged numbers. For now though, this is the first one, so it'll serve as our baseline. We'll look at MOSFET and memory thermals in a second as well. For GPU temperatures, the Gigabyte Eagle card ran approximately 61 degrees Celsius against a 21 degree inlet ambient temperature throughout the course of the test. The ramp was predictable, and it took about 300 seconds to hit steady state. The RTX 3080 Founders Edition card took 700 seconds to soak, so the time is longer, but it's also reaching a higher temperature at 70 degrees Celsius versus 61. Both coolers are noise normalized to 40 dBA here. This means that for pure efficiency and ignoring all VBIOS profile parameters, the Gigabyte Eagle is performing better thermally. Board power was not normalized for these, so we need to look at those numbers for a full picture. Here's total board power consumption as mapped to the previous thermals chart. The Eagle card pulls between 325 and 350 watts total board power in this particular workload, although we'll have more specific power numbers later. The RTX 3080 FE card had a VBIOS limit where it was in the range of 315 to 340 watts. Overall, they're similar, but the Eagle card is set to pull more power to support higher boosting behavior. The fact that it's performing better thermally, while also allowing more power through the board, is evidence that, even for all of its efforts, NVIDIA's Founders Edition design isn't technically the best on the market. Simple coolers still benefit GPU thermal and board-wide performance. Here's the component thermal performance for the Eagle card. Ambient temperature was a relatively constant 21 degrees Celsius, as shown here, and was flat once steady state was achieved. The strange cables that Gigabyte used ran 57 degrees internally at the housing when at 40 dBA or 20-inch distance noise levels for the cooler. And that's fine. The cable itself is rated for 80 degrees Celsius, so this isn't a problem, especially since we're probing a cable that's thermally insulated by the other cables around it. The GDDR6X thermals ran about 74 degrees at steady state and required about 450 seconds to return to baseline unloaded temperature after the workload ended. VRM MOSFET temperature measured 66 degrees Celsius at steady state, requiring an additional 20 seconds to cool back down after the test conclusion. Overall, these temperatures are completely acceptable. We haven't looked at other partner models yet, so we can't say if they're comparatively good. But we can at least show that these numbers are within the tolerances of both components. Maximum GDDR6X temperature is 110 degrees Celsius. We're taking the measurement on the flip chip at the PCB, so we can't get internal die temperatures of the memory, but we're as close as you can reasonably get externally. This is still fine though, even accounting for that possible delta, and we're well within the capabilities of GDDR6X with this cooler. The MOSFETs can handle well over 100 degrees Celsius and so are also completely fine here. And here's a look at auto thermals when the card is controlling its own fan curve. The card runs a temperature target of 63 degrees Celsius, with GDDR6X thermals, for the module we tested anyway, at about 76 to 78 degrees Celsius. The VRM MOSFET we measured plotted about 69 to 70 degrees, and cable temperature was about 58 degrees for this one. As for how the fan RPM responded to the previous test, here it is. The fans ramped to about 1600 to 1700 RPM to hold the temperature target. We'll need an acoustic map to look at what that really means though. Here's that fan curve. This is with a ramping workload and with the GPU left to self-regulate. So we're seeing fans ramp according to the load. Hysteresis is visible here with the lag somewhat low, with the initial ramp jumping from 30 to 33 dBA in just a few seconds. The card eventually steps up another few dBA at once before finally leveling out with a target at 37.8 for auto settings. Looking at the FE card, it eventually ramps over and past the Eagle card when left to auto control, peaking at about 42 dBA at a 20-inch distance before leveling off closer to 40 to 41. The Eagle card remains overall superior in thermal and acoustic design, even when noise normalized in previous charts, because it can support higher power at lower noise and temperatures. That doesn't mean it's the best model. We still need to test the rest of them, but it's doing better than the FE so far in these metrics. Here's the manually controlled noise versus RPM graph. We'll just present this one straight and without any scrolling. You can see here that at a given RPM, the RTX 3090 FE ran the loudest. That makes sense. The blades are further out, they're larger fans, and they must spin faster at the outer edge. RPM normalized noise admittedly isn't all that useful anyway, since no one uses their coolers this way. But a lot of people ask that we look into it, and this hopefully highlights the point for why it's not a particularly useful metric. You should ultimately be normalizing for noise or for linear feet per minute flow, not RPM, because RPM doesn't have the same implication on all fan designs and sizes. The 3080 FE runs technically quieter at a given noise level than the 3080 Eagle, but that's because one of its fans is on the backside of the board, and it's running two fans, whereas the Eagle is all front mounted. Here's the frequency comparison. The Eagle plots closer to 2000 MHz, typically around 1995 MHz, when auto-controlled and running our game synthetic workload. The 3080 FE card plots about 1920 to 1935 MHz, allowing the Eagle an advantage by way of its lower temperature and therefore higher boost. It's particularly possible to be higher boosting when considering the also higher power target. The 40 dBA Eagle plotted a flatter line, but didn't boost much higher. It was just more consistent. This next test looks at Coldplate flatness. The reason this test is useful is because it helps us understand the data we've just gone through on the thermal side and show that it's not just the fans and the surface area that comprise a good cooler, but also the contact of the cold plate to the silicon. In this test, the RTX 3080 Eagle had fairly consistent point-to-point depth, most in the 33 to 36 micron area, but it had one of the worst peaks we've seen so far at 104 microns. We were only able to find one such spot, but it was repeatable. The rest of the cooler is overall consistent aside from this point, so this could be manufacturing variance. Comparatively, the good results in this test have the consistency far better than the 3080 FE, albeit worse with that severe spike. The 2080 Ti Strix remains the best Coldplate flatness that we've tested thus far though, and is a benchmark for what we'd be looking for ideally. Using 3D imaging and pressure sensing tools, we also created this map of contacts between the Eagle GPU and the Coldplate. This first one is a pseudo-color image, but we have a 3D image next. Overall, contact is good. We're not missing any major spots of contact aside from 2 corners. Paste will fill the gaps, as a reminder, but you still want to be relatively even, plate-wide, for the contact against the silicon. The benefit of the heat pipe and plate design is that it's easier to flatten than a vapor chamber, which is what the Founders Edition design is using. We'll put up 2 of the pressure maps from the 3090 FE and 3080 FE as a comparison. You can see that these have more gaps in the coverage than the Eagle, and so the Eagle's Coldplate contact is contributing to its better thermal performance overall, alongside the cooler design. Here's a 3D map of the pressure results. Although this isn't a literal height map, it's representative of where pressure is uneven and where paste is most important. Overall, the Gigabyte cooler has good contact to the center of the die, with slightly lacking contact elsewhere, and more severely lacking contact at the very far corners. That's overall improved versus the Founders Edition cards that we've seen thus far. Gaming performance is frankly not important for card reviews once you get down to partner models. You're mostly looking for quality of life improvements like acoustics, cooler efficiency or warranty support, overclocking capabilities, which this is severely lacking, and accessibility in a given region in the world. That said, we'll look at just a couple games. If you want more detail on these, check the full 3080 review. It's mostly the same, within a couple percent, for the partner models as it is for the Founders Edition, at least or especially when stock. With Horizon Zero Dawn at 4K, the RTX 3080 Eagle plotted about 1 FPS average ahead of the 3080 FE stock card. Lows are within variance run to run. The 3080 FE overclock scored higher, and Gigabyte can't really do much to combat this since it's stuck at its same power target of just 100%. There's no additional headroom. Here's the Three Kingdoms benchmark at 4K. The difference is about 2% in favor of the Eagle, so not much change here either. Technically it's better, which maps to the frequency bump that we observed, but not in a way that matters. You should buy based on availability, thermals, noise, and things like warranty support instead. And just to underscore how little the gaming performance matters once you get down to partner models, here's Red Dead 2. In this one, we are within the wider run-to-run variance. The card plot's functionally the same between them, and we can't determine a difference one way or the other. We're going to cut away to a quick teardown section now, and we'll cut through this quickly. We've already got some teardowns of other cards on the channel by now, so you can get the full look in those, but this we're going to focus more on this specific card. For screws, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that hold the backplate in. I've taken this apart a few times at this point to get the thermocouples in there, and these 2 on the outer edge are smaller. These are all Phillips 1 screws. And once we get the backplate off, we'll talk more about what's underneath. One more screw here I didn't mention that secures the cooler to the PCB. The backplate, annoyingly, will not come off until we remove the, which is an annoying way to construct things for reasons that will soon become clear. Okay, 3 cables. So there's LEDs up here, and then fans. And now we get to the really interesting and bizarro land thing that Gigabyte did. Still don't quite understand this mess right here, but let's free the backplate and look at that. So in the thermal testing we presented earlier, there was one line on there called cable temperature. This is where it came from. So we probed one of the, specifically 12 volt, not that it really matters, but one of the 12 volt lines in the middle of the connector, and that's where that number came from. Thermals were fine. These are rated for 80 degrees Celsius. They are 16 gauge, 16 AWG wire. This is just weird. You can see what they did was they were limited on space on the board, and they wanted 2 8-pins, which are present on the outside anyway in this kind of gross plastic housing, insulator housing, but there's 2 8-pins, and then those are 1-to-1 pin mapped to these. So this is going to be, I think, also 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. So they're mostly 1-to-1 mapped. I used the DMM to figure out which went where. And on the mod mat over here, you can see our mapping of GPU power. This is, you can get this on store.gamersnexus.net if you want one. So we've got the PCIe power here. And what I did was I checked against the 12 volt line to the connector and found out where they mapped. But ultimately, this is just a very strange way to do things. It is an attempt at a solution for the problem, of not having enough board space for 2 traditional 8 pins mounted straight to the board. And this is, I think, I haven't studied the reference designs too much yet, but I think this is a reference NVIDIA PCB, which is why it was out early and why it's a $700 model. It looks like NVIDIA kind of limited the amount of space on the reference board, so you end up with this when they start adding things like large inductors toward the outer edge. And that's the end result for this one. Also, the cable placement limits them too. Typically, you'd see those 2 8 pins over here. So kind of weird, but overall, the cable temperature was fine. It seems bizarre to do. It wasn't particularly bad. Now, as for the rest of the design, you can still see there's a bunch of shunt resistors everywhere. They have a lot more this generation than past generations. There's even, let's see, I think there's at least one on the back as well. And then for the cooler, this is what we have. So it is a single copper cold plate. Flatness was good, as you saw, and thermal pads direct to the memory, fairly full coverage on those. You can see the imprints on them, so they are making contact. Thermal pads here for the VRM components. So there's your MOSFETs, and over here we've got some MOSFET contact as well, and in addition to some capacitor contact. For heat pipes, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I can see here, and it looks like those are 6 mil pipes. So those are running this direction through there. As always, the more heat pipe contact against the GPU area, the better, not just the cold plate, but the GPU area specifically. Gigabyte's still doing that weird thing where it's got screws in the cold plate, and then it looks like 3.5 heat pipes to maybe 4 are making pretty good coverage on the GPU. All of them are making really good coverage right here, and then there's pretty good coverage actually on this memory as well. So the weak spot would be this, and that's one of the memory modules we measured in our thermal testing, and it did fine, and it should be the worst performing out of all of them, so they're good there. This one's another weak spot, especially as you get towards the bottom of the PCB, which this is, because now it's pushed against the motherboard as well, and these are vertically oriented fins, so that's where they're exhausting. So that's it for the disassembly. Pretty easy to take apart. It's annoying that the backplate comes off the way it does. Gigabyte, if you're listening, please mount these to the back of the card in the future instead of to the cooler, because then a user can pull the backplate without disassembling the entire thing. That would be preferable, but overall this is pretty standard assembly and design, except for the cables. That's weird. So that's the Eagle then. It is superior in thermal and acoustic and noise normalized performance to the Founders Edition 3080. This is a 3-fan design. It's benefited there. It is a more traditional design, and it's still got a lot of surface area for the fin stack. It's just oriented in a different way. So versus the FE card, this one does well. It's supposed to be a $700 model. We don't actually know. I haven't seen it in stock ever. So it's been in stock, but I've never seen it in stock, which means that I have no idea what the retailers are actually selling it for. What I know is that officially, Gigabyte says its MSRP is $700. That tends to be pretty accurate. If it's $700 and the FE is $700, this is, by all technical accounts, the superior device, except for overclocking capabilities. The FE doesn't have dual VBIOS either, so they're equal on that ground. But the FE card allows a higher power target, and that becomes the main issue with this card. It's not much higher, it's maybe 20 watts or so, but it's enough to start creating a difference in overclock performance. This you don't really get very much. As a stock device, it does completely fine. The gaming performance is roughly equivalent to the FE card. You're maybe within 2%, often in the positive direction because the frequency stock is higher. But we don't really have any major complaints with this one other than some of the build quality stuff. So for the backplate, we'd really like to see them leverage that backplate and actually do something with it. Whenever partners put a metal backplate on a card, but there's no thermal pad contact to it, it's just sort of a letdown because what it ends up doing is trapping heat against the PCB. So if you do thermal pad mods, sometimes we'll see like a 1 to 2 degree improvement. In the most severe case, we saw, I think it was like a 5 to 7 degree improvement in memory temperatures for some older device. Typically though, it's 1 to 2 degrees. So it's not a huge change because even though it's a good amount of surface area, but it's flat and there's no fan on it. So unless you can solve those two things, or you can at least get some air over it, you're not going to get much more than 1 or 2 degrees. That said, at the same time, $700 device, it sort of feels bad to not use free cooling performance effectively when thermal pads cost what they do, which is not much. You're pennies for depending on the volume they're buying and the quality. But you don't need a high quality thermal pad to get a little bit of use out of this backplate, or at least make it not trap the heat against the PCB. Overall, though, performance is comparatively good versus the FE card. The noise normalized performance is superior, the thermal performance is superior, and boosting is a bit higher stock to stock because of the higher native power target, although again, it lacks the offset for more than that. So we don't really have a problem with it. We didn't run into any major issues. We haven't seen the crashing issue. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen on this card, but we haven't seen it. You've likely heard of it at this point, where some users are experiencing crashes. There's a couple different theories out there for it. One of them is related to the capacitors. The main issue seems to be when they boost above 2000 megahertz, then you start running into problems. Whether or not the capacitors are related, we're not sure yet, but that seems to be the main issue. So we didn't see that on this device, but this device probably has maybe 30 to 40 hours, maybe 30 hours of testing on it. That said, this is all just specific benchmarks we run, so there's a good chance that as you get into other applications, you'll see something we didn't. So we can't really speak to the crashiness of the 3080 cards, but as a device, it's good overall compared to the 3080 FE. Some downsides, but we've gone through those now. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by picking up things like this shirt or the mod mats. And you can also go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.